Welcome to Nature Nights, where we discuss Florida ecology and conservation efforts within some of the Sunshine State's ecosystems. I'm Jenny.
I'm Stephanie.
I'm Andrea.
And I'm Cesar. Today we'll talk about our beautiful state's freshwater marshes. Let's get started.
Before we talk about freshwater marshes, let's discuss what exactly a marsh is. A marsh is a wetland that is dominated by herbaceous plants, which means they are not woody. These plants are rooted in and generally emergent from shallow water that stands at or above the surface for much of the year.
What are the main characteristics of a Florida marsh?
There are three characteristics that broadly describe a Florida freshwater marsh: long hydro periods, shallow water depths, and shallow dry depths. When looking at freshwater marshes closer, we can separate them based on four factors. These factors are water source, subsurface, hydrology, and fire frequency. Water source is the first factor to identifying marsh types. There are four water source options. A freshwater marsh may be supplied through rainfall, groundwater inflow, surface water inflow, or by being adjacent to a river or a lake.
The next main factors of marshes are within the subsurface. There are three main soil types in freshwater marshes which determine the rest of the ecosystems there. Peat is a type of soil which consists of partially decomposed plant material. It occurs in marshes that are deep with longer inundation periods, which means periods of water above the soil. Peat soaks up water and stores it like a sponge, and it retains nutrients that are vital for plant survival there. Another soil type is marl. It forms when there is a limestone layer that is dissolved by acidic water, and periphyton, which are microbes that are mostly photosynthetic, absorbs the acid, leaving calcium carbonate behind. Marl occurs in marshes with limestone in short inundation periods, and it holds onto water, which is important for life. Sand is the next type of soil found in freshwater marshes, which are near flowing waters, short inundation periods, and higher fire frequency, which burns off organic matter. All of these soil types characterize freshwater marshes, and the type of soil is determined by fire frequency and hydro period.
All the different types of marshes need a different hydro period and fire frequency. The things that make up the hydro period is how often flooding happens and the depth of the flooding, including the minimum and the maximum point. Also, fire allows the neighboring plants to not survive and keep the vegetation herbaceous instead of woody.
Hey Cesar, are there different kinds of marshes or only one main kind?
Hey Stephanie, that's a great question. There are quite a few different marshes like the Basin Marsh. It has the longest hydro period, which usually flooded year-round, and fire happens around every 5 to 7 years during the end of the drying season. A depression marsh dries up more often and happens seasonally. This marsh has frequent fires since it occurs within a fire-dependent ecosystem. A floodplain marsh is flooded around 300 days a year up to year-round, and the fire frequency depends on the dominant vegetation. A slough has extreme droughts but does not happen every year, and fire rarely to never happens due to the high humidity and the long hydro period. Fire frequency for the glade marsh and slough marsh is roughly the same, about 3 to 10 years. However, the hydro period is different, with the glade marsh being flooded more than half the year and the slough marsh being flooded during late summer and early fall.
With all this variable flooding, vegetation in this ecosystem can vary depending on the type of marsh. But for the most part, freshwater marshes are non-forested, meaning that they have mostly herbaceous plants that are in shallow water. These are known as the hydrophytic plants, and they have adapted to tolerate flooding. Some examples are the longleaf bryon and the Jamaican sawgrass. These flood-tolerant plants also include tall reed species such as the pink mollygrass and cattail, which can be found in disturbed areas. The dominant plants you can find in freshwater marshes are the maiden can, alligator flag, pickerel weed, and St. John's wort. This vegetation makes it ideal for many animals to thrive in a freshwater marsh. Wading birds, such as multiple species of ibis and herons, use these plants as refuge and food, while the American alligator and the banded water snake use them to hide from prey, or simply just use them as a habitat.
Are there any other organisms that are key to the freshwater marsh?
Actually, Jenny, yeah, there is. These microorganisms are known as periphyton, and they are mostly photosynthetic. They are the base of the food chain, and they add oxygen to the water as a waste product of photosynthesis. They also retain water during the drought season to benefit the plants. Freshwater marshes are of great ecological importance in the state of Florida. They capture water as well as purify it, and they replenish Florida's aquifers. According to the National Wildlife Federation, the Everglades provides a third of Florida's drinking water and agricultural water use. The peat found in the soil holds water as well, helping with flood abatement. Marshes store carbon as they are inundated, so soil microbes cannot access oxygen for aerobic respiration. They are also beneficial in the way that the water above the soil slows decomposition rates of organic matter, which would release CO2. The release of carbon dioxide increases global warming since it's a greenhouse gas. It's already too hot in Florida, so I'm thankful for our marshes for keeping us a little bit cooler.
One of the main issues with freshwater marshes is the draining of wetlands for the development of homes and for mosquito control, since they lay their larvae in still water. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, which is a gas that traps heat in our atmosphere and may increase global warming. And according to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, CO2 accounts for 78% of greenhouse gases. Also, according to the book Wetlands by William Mitch, wetlands store between 20 to 30% of carbon and yet only take up between 5 to 8% of the Earth's surface. So they are super important in mitigating climate change. I'm actually an undergraduate researcher for the Aquatic Biogeochemistry Lab, where I've compared the carbon dioxide flux between various soil types during dry events, meaning no water above the soil surface, and inundated conditions, meaning there's a water level of 20 centimeters above the soil surface. We went out to 6 different sites for intact soil core collection, which is depicted here, brought them back to the field research building, simulated rainwater events with dry and flooded conditions, and recorded CO2 flux with the instrument called LICOR. When analyzing the data, it was clear the dry events released more CO2 than the flooded events among the soil types. This indicates draining marshes may be depleting our natural carbon sinks, which may contribute to global warming. Another colleague of mine, named Anthony Marabito, is a PhD student in the lab and is well acquainted with these issues in wetlands. Hey Anthony, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Jenny. Thanks. I just got back from the lab. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. So, what have you been doing in the lab with your research?
So right now, I have been focusing on carbon storage within wetlands, and in particular, I'm investigating how the physical, molecular, and biogeochemical properties of coastal wetlands are influenced carbon storage.
So why are wetlands so important for the environment?
Oh, that is a great question, Jenny. So wetlands, they have several ecosystem services, some including carbon storage and reservoirs, nutrient transformation, habitat for organisms, and so wetlands typically are at low elevations, and so they collect water and from upstream, and within this water they can be transferring nutrients and improving water quality. Wetlands also do a really good job at storing carbon, typically in the form of soil and plant biomass, which helps keep carbon out of the atmosphere and into soils and wetlands.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I know my project is about storing CO2 in the soil, and that's a big deal. So how could draining wetlands lead to environmental issues because of that?
Yeah, so wetlands, one reason wetlands tend to store a lot of carbon is due to their anaerobic conditions of being inundated. And so with land use change, also just like natural changes in like precipitation patterns, some wetlands are actually losing water and they are becoming drier, which results in microbes being able to more efficiently and effectively use carbon stored in these soils as their energy source, and so they end up respiring it just as we breathe out carbon dioxide. They respire carbon as well, and so this takes carbon that has been stored in soils and puts it back into the atmosphere.
So we know that wetlands are pretty important in storing CO2 in their soil, so can you tell us a little bit on how they are effective in storing it?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, wetlands do a really good job at storing carbon typically in the form of soil, and even though wetlands typically make up 6% of the global area, they are estimated to store actually 20 to 30% of the global carbon. And so even with small area, they are very carbon rich, and along with having anaerobic conditions that help store carbon, and in particular, coastal wetlands do a really good job at sequestrating the carbon out of the atmosphere, and they have been studies that actually show that they can sequester carbon faster than tropical rainforests, about 10 times faster. And they also can store about, and again, this is just coastal wetlands, but they can store 10 times more carbon per area of tropical rainforests. And so even though we typically think of tropical rainforests to be very productive, carbon rich ecosystems, these coastal wetlands are even more effective at storing carbon. And one possible reason is due to tides bringing in nutrients, allowing them to just be able to be very productive at taking out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then putting it into their own biomass.
Thank you, Anthony, for taking some time out to talk to us about your research and your knowledge on wetlands.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to help, and I'll see you in the lab, Jenny.
Yeah, see you in the lab.
Another huge conservation issue is peat mining. Peat mining releases a large amount of carbon into the air and is not allowing the area to sequester new carbon. With this, mining for peat increases fire frequency and decreases plant diversity. It increases flood risk as peat in the area decreases and it cannot hold the water. The pollution from peat mining also releases toxic chemicals that the peat holds. This pollution allows for climate change with increased global warming, which then leads to species extinction.
The Everglades is one of the largest glades marsh that is found, and it also includes a diverse mix of ecosystems like sloughs and marl prairies, which are considered freshwater marshes. The Herbert Hoover Dike was originally made to prevent flooding to the nearby lands and towns. A leave is built and the current height is about 30 feet. The dike prevents the natural water flow of the sloughs and the marsh near Lake Okeechobee. Humans are causing more and more fires in the Everglade than nature itself. This has a negative effect on peat since it will burn up and lose the materials it has that allows the growth of plants. The marsh is dominantly sawgrass, but all the pollution and the runoff from fertilizers used are allowing for more growth of cattail. The marl prairie need limestone close to the surface without the soil type will change to either peat or sand. There is a lot of limestone mining that is happening near the Everglades, and the pits are dug up and just filled back with water. This decreases the total area of marl prairies.
Like Cesar mentioned, agricultural runoff is a major threat to Florida's marshes. Overuse of pesticides and fertilizer leave excess nutrients in the soil. After a rainfall, the nutrients run off into a nearby water source, creating a toxic environment for the species that call it home. This promotes growth of invasive species such as the cattail. Human sewage from septic tanks that leak into the water have a similar effect. Finally, human use such as cattle grazing and recreational use destroy Florida's freshwater marshes.
There have been many efforts to preserve America's wetlands, including Florida's freshwater marshes. According to the Fish and Wildlife Service, the North American Wetland Conservation Act was initiated in 1989. This group has granted nearly $2 billion to over 3,000 projects in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency established the Clean Water Act in 1972. It establishes a structure for regulating pollutants in the water of wetlands. It implemented programs such as setting wastewater standards for surface waters. You can even report any unlawful activity done to freshwater marshes to the EPA under the Clean Water Act, which is very cool and it makes the community feel heard.
The Comprehensive Everglade Restoration Plan, or CERP for short, is made up of 50 individual projects. The plan of the project is to restore, preserve, and protect the southern ecosystem and all the marshes that are connected through the Kissimmee-Okeechobee Everglade watershed. The main plan is to fill canals and levees, finish the Tamiami Trail Bridge, and add flow basins and add more than 6,000 acres of stormwater treatment areas.
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife sells federal duck stamps that donate to restoring and maintaining Florida's wetlands. 98% of the money spent on the stamp goes back to aiding in conservation or purchasing lands for national wildlife refuges. Whether it's to hunt migratory birds, part of a stamp collection, or to support habitat conservation, anyone can purchase a duck stamp. Under the Duck Stamp Act, migratory bird hunters over the age of 16 are required to possess a signed duck stamp along with the proper hunting licenses to legally hunt. Federal duck stamps also appeal to stamp and wildlife art collectors. Did you know that the federal duck stamp is the longest running single-themed stamp in the world? They also gain you free admission to any national wildlife refuge that charges a fee. With the federal duck stamp, hunters, artists, wildlife art collectors, and birders alike can aid in the conservation of wetland habitats, including our Florida's freshwater marshes.
Wetland mitigation is also another important conservation measure, where environmental scientists delineate or outline wetlands before development, and the person wanting to build on that land has to pay for another wetland to be made somewhere else. While these are some examples of measures being taken, you can also get involved in other ways personally.
Some great ways you can help preserve our marsh is by conserving water. Another great way is to help is recycling.
You can also contact the local and state government to express your concerns for Florida's wetlands. Go out and explore your local marshes, such as the Orlando wetlands.
Use peat-free mulch and potting soil.
You can also use organic fertilizers rather than chemicals to help fight agricultural runoff. Let's create more gardens while also considering the health of our waters.
And that's all for us this week. Thanks for listening.
We hope these podcasts have been useful for you and will motivate you to take action.
Nature Nights out.